20,000 feet above the barren Black Rock Desert in Nevada, Fleet Admiral Torak's massive stealth mothership hovered silently above the cloud deck. His high-precision fire control radar swept quietly over the dried-up salt flats below, the screens confirming the absolute absence of microwave signals or military anti-air installations. Torak sneered, raising a glass of purple Victory Vintage to his lips. He had just issued the command to his adjutant to initiate the surface cleansing protocol when, without warning, an ungodly roar instantly shredded the mothership's lower deflector shields. A solid metal cylinder, spray-painted with a flaming skull and emitting absolutely zero thermal-guided lock-on signals, smashed through the bridge's reinforced glass at a violent Mach 3. Reeking of acrid gunpowder, it slammed brutally into Torak's holographic command console. The alien tactical nexus threw a flurry of fatal errors. Its processors, capable of calculating planetary orbits, completely failed to comprehend how this solid hunk of dumb iron, devoid of electronic components and flying blind on pure physical inertia, had penetrated their radar net. Meanwhile, 20,000 feet below, Charlie, a shirtless redneck geek, stared at his civilian radar screen and howled with laughter. Hell yeah. Boys, looks like our rocket just nailed a flock of low-flying birds. Roll out the rest of them, pronto. Boiling hot glass shards raked across Torak's exposed gray forearms, leaving 3 jagged gashes in their wake. Blue-purple stellar blood instantly soaked the cuffs of his uniform, heavily embroidered with the Imperial starburst. The crystal goblet of purple vintage slipped from his grasp, shattering against the metal deck with a sharp crash, sending thick liquor and glass flying everywhere. Torak froze, his pupils dilating in sheer shock. He had lived for 120 galactic standard years and subjugated 17 advanced civilizations, yet he had never witnessed an attack so utterly absurd. The metal cylinder now embedded in his command console's core processor had crooked, shoddy weld seams and was still dusted with grains of alkaline desert sand. The thick black smoke spewing from its tail section was rapidly scorching the 100 million credit holographic projection array into a bubbled, charred mess. The bridge was completely flooded with the stinging, bizarre stench of ammonium perchlorate mixed with asphalt. The bridge's red alert sirens finally snapped into action, a half-beat too late. Every Imperial sailor on deck vaulted from their seats, while the error codes on their consoles cascaded faster than a waterfall. Designed exclusively to intercept smart interstellar missiles, the fire control system couldn't even identify the hunk of iron in front of it, reducing its output to meaningless, confused beeps. Torak kicked a nearby alloy side table with savage force, sending metal components clattering across the deck. He snatched the communicator off the bulkhead, his knuckles turning white, his voice fracturing with rage. "Frigate, Commander! Initiate maximum defensive countermeasures across the entire fleet, immediately. Bring all electromagnetic interceptors and fire control radars online. I demand to know what the hell that thing is." He slammed the comms unit back onto the console, panting heavily as he glared at the bizarre, smoke-spewing rocket wreckage. Cold sweat was already soaking through the inner lining of his uniform. The strobe of the red alert siren sent waves of throbbing pain through the frigate commander's optic nerve. Knuckles white, he slammed the scanner up to its maximum resolution, practically pressing his face against the screen full of jumping glitch code. Coolant hissed and sprayed from the seams of the overloaded scanning module, splashing onto the back of his hand and making him flinch from the biting cold. But the material analysis results that finally popped up on the screen made every hair on his neck stand on end. His boots crunched over the shattered reinforced glass littering the deck. Forgetting entirely to render a military salute, his voice cracked like it had been dragged over sandpaper. "Admiral, we've scanned the interior of the weapon that breached our shields. There are 0 guidance chips. We can't even find a single copper transmission wire. The payload consists entirely of low-grade fertilizer, industrial aluminum powder, and melted asphalt residue. He threw an arm toward another frantically flashing fire control terminal just as two small sparks of metal exploded from its overloaded indicator lights. The anti-air system's EMP interception logic is designed strictly for smart guided munitions. It's completely useless against a solid iron slug propelled purely by solid fuel. The Fire Control Core has logged 30,000 consecutive errors and is stuck in a reboot loop. Charlie, shirtless and sporting a gnarly sunburn, flicked the butt of his cigarette into the dirt beneath the scorched, empty launch rack. Half-dried ammonium perchlorate powder was still caked beneath his fingernails. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a frantic, strobing red glow hovering in the cloud deck above, right as the camp's civilian walkie-talkies erupted in a deafening burst of static. He slammed his half-empty can of ice-cold beer onto the hard-baked alkaline dirt, sending a ring of foamy spray flying as the aluminum crumpled. He kicked over a stack of empty fertilizer bags and let out a bellow in his thick southern Nevada drawl, completely drowning out the camp's rock and roll speakers. Son of a bitch! It's those bastards from the FA with their damn weather balloons again. We shot down their spy kite last time, and now they got the balls to hover right over us and try to confiscate our gear. The dozen or so rednecks squatting around grinding rocket nozzles instantly exploded into a frenzy. Wrenches clanged against steel pipes in a rapid-fire chorus. One guy vaulted straight into the bed of a Ford F-150, ripping off an old tarp to reveal 5 massive fertilizer rockets welded from thick-walled sewer pipes, their tail fins crooked and haphazard. Without even unhooking the tie-downs properly, a few of the boys hoisted the 100-pound iron beasts onto a row of rusty, peeling launch racks. A heavily bearded buddy casually dumped half an unopened bag of industrial aluminum powder into the fuel seam of the outermost rocket, cussing the whole time about blowing that FAA balloon into ragged cotton. Charlie stepped over a mess of scattered crescent wrenches, empty beer cans, and spilled ammonium perchlorate, striding over to the spare battery of a salt-dusted Ford F-150. His grease-stained fingers dug into the cracked black insulation of the jumper cables, viciously prying the worn copper clamps open as wide as they'd go. With a sharp clack, he bit one clamp down hard onto the positive terminal. The copper on the other end was frayed to hell, but he didn't even bother with insulated gloves. He just slammed the clamp straight onto the negative post. Blinding blue-white electrical sparks instantly exploded from the exposed metal joints. Hissing current ripped through the dry desert air, and a split second later, the primers of all 5 rockets blew out roaring orange-yellow flames. The heavy iron slugs instantly generated a terrifying amount of thrust. The unfastened steel chains on the peeling launch racks rattled violently before 2 of them snapped outright. The blistering heat wave from the exhaust scorched Charlie's sunburnt chest. He stumbled back a half step, his booming roar overpowering the distorted guitar riffs blasting from the camp. The 5 rockets, slapped together from sewer pipes, completely ignored every known rule of aerodynamics. The payloads wobbled like a buffalo that had just downed 3 bottles of whiskey. Each one trailed a pitch-black tail of thick asphalt smoke the size of a wash basin, streaking 5 crooked ink-black lines across the blinding midday desert sky. Scorching particles of ammonium perchlorate and aluminum powder spewed wildly from the nozzles, burning a string of blackened craters into the dry salt flats. The Redneck crew went wild, chucking their ice-cold beers into the air and slapping the hoods of their trucks, hollering at the top of their lungs. The climb trajectories of the 5 rockets were pure, random chaos. One drifted wildly off to the side after just 200 meters. Another violently jerked upward, nearly clipping the camp's comms antenna. The massive volume of superheated black smoke unfurled into a sky-blotting curtain behind them, riding the desert wind straight toward the airspace, hiding the stealth mothership. Pale blue stellar blood was still seeping around the shards of reinforced glass embedded in Fleet Admiral Thorax forearms. His eyes were glued to the live feed from the optical sensors. The radar array was still locked in a frantic reboot cycle, popping up a red, unmatched smart weapon signature error window every 3 seconds. In the visual feed, the 5 thick black contrails looked like 5 drunken, inky serpents, dragging burning embers of asphalt right toward the core airspace of the mothership's deflector shields. The dense, superheated smoke even began to foul the edges of the optical lenses, creating a greasy, distorted mirage around the screen's borders. Even the Empire's most cutting-edge algorithms couldn't isolate a single aerodynamically logical flight path from the mess. Torak had fought over 100 interstellar campaigns of conquest and leveled the homeworlds of 17 advanced civilizations, yet he had never encountered an attack this outrageously primitive. No guidance signals, no plasma shielding, not even the most basic thruster signatures for attitude adjustment. The 5 iron slugs were brute-forcing their way into the sky with raw, savage power, their trajectories drifting so erratically that the most advanced fire control systems couldn't predict their drop zones a second in advance. He violently swept his arm across the command console, sending an alloy cup of high-energy nutrient paste flying. The pale blue liquid splashed across the flashing red error screens, fizzing into thin white smoke. He roared at the sweat-drenched frigate commander beside him, his voice so loud that his bionic vocal cords actually vibrated. "Scramble 5 electromagnetic interceptors immediately. Full power to maximum EMP. I don't care what those primitive garbage cans are made of, but before they touch my deflector shields, you will reduce them to cosmic dust." The heavy armored hangar doors slowly began to lift on their hydraulic axes, letting the dry, howling winds of the Black Rock Desert flood the hangar bay corridor. The engines of the 5 electromagnetic interceptors, glowing with cold blue light, had already completed their full-power warm-up, their blue plasma exhaust swirling violently within the bay. The moment Torak's launch command dropped through the command channel, the frigate commander slammed his hand down on the launch authorization button on pure reflex. The heavy hydraulic rams of the hangar doors let out a muffled, thunderous roar, and the final hermetic seal popped open with a sharp click. Riding a surge of thrust that vibrated right through the deck, the 5 interceptors shot down the electromagnetic catapult rails. Their cold blue ion trails drew 5 dead straight lines of light across the clear sky of the Black Rock Desert, heading on a direct collision course toward the 5 iron lumps chugging upward on pillars of black smoke. He pressed his face practically against the tactical display, watching as the 5 bright blue dots representing the interceptors instantly accelerated to Mach 3, locking flawlessly onto an intercept trajectory with the 5 fertilizer rockets. The chimes indicating full EMP charge completion rang out back-to-back across the bridge. The frigate commander kicked aside a tipped-over canister of nutrient paste, screaming into the tactical comms channel until his voice broke. "Lock onto target silhouettes. Release maximum yield pulses. Fry these unguided, primitive pieces of trash into plasma." Less than 300 meters from the closest iron-shelled rocket, the 5 interceptors simultaneously triggered their weapon systems. 5 nearly transparent ripples of high-frequency electromagnetic waves exploded outward from the fighters like a massive, expanding net, instantly washing over every incoming target. The frigate commander's knuckles dug viciously into the edge of the console. Pale blue blood seeped from his wounds, dripping onto the flickering tactical display. He had just personally watched the 5 EMP ripples sweep the entire interception zone. According to the Galactic Empire's tactical manual, even a heavy cruiser taking a full power pulse like that would have its electronic core instantly melted to slag. Yet on the display, the 5 red dots representing those crude rockets didn't stutter for even a fraction of a second. Their kinetic energy readouts were still climbing like crazy. The onboard rapid scan modules instantly beamed back analytical data, and his pupils shrank to pinpricks. Aside from red-hot grains of ammonium perchlorate and roiling thermite powder, there wasn't a single conductive copper wire inside those iron shells. The high-frequency EMPs, powerful enough to cripple a continental grid, had passed right through them without a single target to lock onto, a complete and utter dud. He screamed, lunging to issue evasive maneuvers to the fighters, but before his fingertips could even graze the comms button, the 5 multi-ton, purely physical iron slugs slammed brutally into them, carrying kinetic energy far exceeding their design threshold. The titanium frames of the interceptors, each one costing as much as 3 colonial transport ships, crumpled into scrap metal like empty soda cans. The internal fusion batteries detonated instantly under the immense crushing force, blooming into 5 blinding bright blue fireballs in the low-altitude airspace. Ear-piercing crash alarms flooded the bridge. The 5 waveforms monitoring the elite pilot's vitals flatlined in perfect unison. The interceptor icons on the tactical screen shattered into flashing pixelated dust, one by one. The high-precision fire control radar, already stuck in a 3-second reboot loop, completely gave up, spitting out 27 continuous error windows. The shockwave even knocked over the admiral's half-empty cup of nutrient paste, sending pale blue liquid cascading over scorching circuit boards with a fizzle of white smoke. The cheap binoculars in Charlie's fingers were caked in half an inch of motor oil. Through the lenses, he perfectly caught the 5 blinding blue explosions in the upper atmosphere. The half-can of ice beer tucked under his arm slipped and smacked onto the baking salt flats, splashing foam all over his boots. He clamped his back teeth onto his cigarette butt and let out a manic laugh. The few little blisters on his sunburnt back from the rocket backdraft didn't bother him in the slightest. He hauled off and kicked the steel tailgate of the Ford F-150, sending the wrenches and pipe grips scattered in the bed clattering into the air. Hell yeah, boys. Those are military drone targets. They're running anti-air drills with us. Break out every last big-ass kicker rocket we got. We are gonna shoot the lights out today. A bit of sand stuck to the blisters on Charlie's back, bringing a stinging itch that he completely ignored. He booted an empty gas can out of the way, his thick southern Nevada drawl drowning out the heavy rock music blasting through the camp. Don't bother calibrating any damn ballistics. Just aim for the shiny spots up in the sky. If you miss, I'm buying you a whole case of ice beer. The dozen or so rednecks let out a collective howl of agreement. A kid in ripped jeans literally dragged the big-ass kicker rockets out from behind a shipping container. Their crude casings were a total freak show. Some were welded from sewer pipes, others from scavenged fire extinguishers, and the wildest one was shoved inside a sawed-off semi-truck exhaust pipe, its caliber jumping from 3 inches to a massive 18. None of them even had a proper set of tail fins. Nobody set up a calibration stand. Nobody calculated drag coefficients. They just dumped them onto the crests of the sand dunes, tying them to nearby rocks with rusty baling wire to hold them in place. A few guys couldn't even be bothered with that. They just laid 3 oversized rockets flat across the rails of the F-150's bed, skipping the launch rack altogether. Over a dozen dust-caked car batteries were lined up in the sand. Jumper cables clamped down on the terminals like gator jaws, spitting crackling, fragmented blue sparks. Not a single guy was wearing insulated gloves. One guy was casually stuffing a half bag of scrap steel nails he found at a construction site into the fuel bay gap of a smaller rocket. He slapped the casing, laughing so hard he slapped his thigh, yelling about giving those target drones up there a real show. Charlie, his beard dusted with aluminum powder, jumped onto the rusted launch rack that had just snapped 2 of its steel chains. He violently shoved the tailpipe of the last massive big-ass kicker rocket into the ignition mount. The moment the copper heads of all the ignition wires were clamped onto the battery terminals, the primers of over 100 rockets instantly hissed to life, spitting, searing, orange-red sparks. The ship-wide alarms suddenly escalated from their intermittent beeping into a high-pitched, deafening screech. Every single external optical probe that hadn't yet burned out triggered a maximum level threat warning at the exact same time. Torak violently swiped away the 27 error windows dancing across the main screen, his gray-blue pupils shrinking to pinpricks. Down on the surface of the Black Rock Desert salt flats, over 100 crooked, thick columns of black smoke had just erupted. The thick smoke from the cheap solid fuel was as black as soaked asphalt. Every single contrail wobbled back and forth like a drunk who had downed 3 bottles of moonshine, completely devoid of logic. Some had barely climbed 30 meters before veering sideways toward the dunes. Others were doing hollow flips in mid-air, heading straight for the underbelly of the Mothership. Mid-air, the temperature readouts for hundreds of thermite combustion points spiked like crazy, instantly breaching the thermal imaging sensor's predefined thresholds and painting the entire screen in sheets of bright red glare. A bone-chilling cold crawled up Torak's spine. He had fought over 100 interstellar campaigns and never seen a weapon bound by the laws of physics fly trajectories this deranged. The frigate commander cranked every fire control calibration knob to its absolute limit. Pushing too hard, he split his scabbed wounds wide open, smearing blue blood onto the scorching hot dials and instantly vaporizing it into pale blue mist. The circuit boards beneath the console, already corroded by nutrient paste, popped and sparked. Immediately after, the high-precision radar screen blasted a blinding white light. Hundreds of thermite combustion points, burning at over 3,000 degrees, instantly overloaded the thermal imaging sensors, shattering the once-ordered scanning grid into a screen full of chaotic white noise. He let out a blood-curdling scream, his claw-like fingers frantically hammering the emergency lock-on buttons on the control panel. The system spat out red error windows faster than his hands could move. Target aerodynamic profile does not match database. Trajectory variable overflow. All electromagnetic marker signals lost. 12 perimeter optical probes popped and blew out in rapid succession, letting off thin trails of blue smoke. The outgoing radar waves crashed straight into a rolling sea of black asphalt smoke, unable to bounce back a single coordinate ping. The fine aluminum powder suspended in that thick smoke was eating the radar waves alive. The operations officer beside him scrambled to yank the backup radar startup lever. The second he pushed it to the top, the exterior housing of the backup sensor was pelted by high-speed solid fuel debris, denting it like a golf ball before it black-screened and crashed 2 seconds later. The frigate commander's scream died in his throat. He stared at the main display, now nothing but static snow, watching helplessly as over 100 erratic, thick black trajectories breached the noise, hurtling mindlessly toward the Mothership's completely undefended exterior armor. Stripped of all navigational references, the stealth Mothership was like a blindfolded giant block of lead thrown onto a roller rink. The previously smooth surface of the deflector shields was hammered back to back by over a dozen of these blind fire rockets. The muffled impacts hit the eardrums of the bridge crew like sledgehammers. The first struck the portside heat sink, plunging the shield's energy bar by 17%. The second slammed into the stealth coating on the ship's underbelly, sending up a shower of metal sparks. The third, by pure dumb luck, smashed dead center into the bow's shield generator. The main console's deflector shield power bar instantly flashed red, and the piercing overload alarm nearly blew the roof off the bridge. A dozen operations personnel panicked, their hands slipping off the control sticks. Someone tried to manually trigger the backup attitude thrusters, but without radar calibration, the blue thrust pushed the ship into a violent sideways lurch. An interstellar campaign commemorative plaque mounted on the bulkhead tore loose and smashed to pieces on the deck. Torak barely kept himself from being thrown across the room by gripping the edge of the command console. He watched helplessly as the deflector shield's remaining power plummeted from 30% to 12%, the system's cold warning voice looping endlessly. Deflector shields approaching critical overload. Deflector shields approaching critical overload. Empty fertilizer bags and warped rocket nozzles were piled haphazardly at Charlie's feet. He bent down and hoisted the base of the final custom-built rocket, packed with scrap nails and bearing the spray-painted white letters, Sci-Fi, across its casing. Two Redneck buddies immediately rushed over to help. Grunting with effort, the three of them heaved the 200-pound iron beast, stuffed to the brim with 50 pounds of titanium powder and thermite, straight onto the roof rack of the Ford F-150. Clamping a scratched, heavy-duty flashlight between his teeth, the beam swept over the exposed brass primer at the rocket's base. He wrapped two rusty, flaking jumper cables around his knuckles a couple of times. Deciding a switch was just a waste of time, he shoved the bare copper wires straight onto the positive and negative terminals of the old battery at his feet. A bright blue-white arc flashed, singeing a tuft of hair sticking up on his forehead. A massive wave of thrust instantly exploded from the rocket's tail, shaking the pickup truck so hard its four off-road tires bounced a half-inch off the salt flats. A deafening sonic boom ripped through the camp, trailing a blinding white exhaust filled with glowing silver titanium particles. This custom rocket bolted skyward like a madman who'd chugged 30 bottles of whiskey. Its trajectory was obscenely erratic. For half a second, it looked like it was going to scrape the top of a dune and crash, but the next second it violently pitched straight up, whipping its black smoke tail into a chaotic, twisting knot. The rednecks standing around with their beers erupted into deafening cheers, tossing their empty cans into the air. The heavy bass from the speakers shook the very sand under their feet. Charlie kept his military binoculars trained on the runaway rocket, watching it wobble its way through a sky full of floating thermite embers, dead set on the gray stealth mothership that was hovering in midair, listing heavily and completely losing its balance. The ship's portside main engine, starving for air to cool its overloaded systems, had flared its intake wide open, a pitch-black hole big enough to easily swallow a pickup truck. The immense suction was pulling all the surrounding black smoke and debris violently inside. The wildly wobbling custom rocket was now less than 10 feet from the intake. The sand stuck to its casing was ripped off by the vacuum, spinning in a fine stream against the metal hull. The next second, the air current jerked the entire missile straight, perfectly aligning it with the gaping dark throat of the engine before it plunged deep into the cherry-red, superheated combustion chamber. Torak's mind was completely consumed by the final countdown to catastrophic system failure. He even manually muted the faint warning chime for the portside main engine intake overload, dismissing it as a redundant alarm. He viciously kicked the back of the frigate commander's chair, the man trembling like a leaf. The sharp crack of Torak's knuckles snapping mixed with his breaking roar. Reroute all non-essential power to the shields. I want to crush those primitive insects on the ground. His words choked in his throat. Out of the corner of his eye, the final surviving narrow-angle optical probe caught a blurry feed. That custom junk rocket, swaying like a drunken square dancer, had been sucked straight by the violent intake current. The sand clinging to its shell was whipped into a fine vortex against the pipe walls, and in the very next second it slid straight down the pitch-black intake duct, swallowed whole by the red-hot depths of the engine's combustion chamber. Before the frigate commander's fingertips could even touch the emergency fuel cutoff on the panel, the lone surviving narrow-angle camera feed was flooded with blinding, absolute white. The 3,000-degree thermite fire detonated without resistance inside the confined engine combustion chamber. 50 pounds of pure titanium powder, mixed with semi-melted ammonium perchlorate chunks, sprayed at high speed through the gaps in the turbine blades. The metal components melted into glowing red slag the instant they made contact. The frigate commander squeezed the control stick so hard his broken knuckles turned white. Blue-purple stellar blood ran down the stick, dripping onto the frantically flashing overload alarm light. The rotor of the portside main engine shattered into hundreds of high-speed fragments from the violent secondary explosion, tearing straight back through the drive shaft and ripping through 3 layers of bulkheads. The entire power module bulged outward in less than a second, overpressurized by the explosive gases. A massive lump swelled out of the ship's once aerodynamic flank. Then came a sickeningly deep boom that felt like it would shatter every bone in their bodies. The entire portside engine bay blew outward, peeling open like a tin can. The titanium alloy hull was twisted into a mangled knot by the internal blast. Scalding tongues of fire, fueled by leaking starship fuel and thermite embers, spewed wildly from the breach, burning away the stealth coating on half the ship until nothing but ash remained. Every mounting bolt on the bridge began popping out in a high-frequency rattle. The port side, totally devoid of thrust, instantly lost all lift. The multi-thousand-ton stealth mothership violently lurched sideways. Every unsecured instrument and piece of debris slid toward the shattered windows across the tilted deck. The fragment of Torak's interstellar campaign commemorative plaque that had been wedged in a console seam slid out with a clink, stopping by his combat boots. The deflector shield's remaining power ticked off its last digit, dropping instantly to 0%. Blue-purple blood from the frigate commanders, split knuckles smeared all over the emergency thrust yoke. Grinding his teeth, he threw all his weight into pushing the yoke to maximum load. The sole remaining main thruster on the starboard side instantly spat a blinding blue plume, desperately trying to wrestle the listing, multi-thousand-ton ship back into a level flight. But without the torque balance from the destroyed port engine, it was completely useless. The massive stealth mothership dropped like a broken lead weight tossed from the sky, plunging sideways into the thick lower atmosphere. The friction of the dense air instantly ignited what little stealth coating was left, turning the hull into a blazing fireball. Trailing a massive rolling tail of black smoke, leaking fuel and thermite embers that stretched for hundreds of meters, the ship plummeted. Torak gripped the command console railing in a death spiral. His gray-blue eyes locked out the shattered viewport as the utterly exposed salt flats of the Black Rock Desert rushed up to meet them at a terrifying speed. The crushing G-force pinned his chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. The coarse armor plating of the ship's belly was the first to scrape against the rock-hard salt crust of the desert, gouging out a deep, spark-showering trench. Tens of thousands of tons of kinetic energy drove the entire ship brutally deep into the sand. The shockwave blasted the lingering ammonium perchlorate powder right out from between Charlie's fingers. The half-empty beer can at his feet launched half a meter into the air with a clank, splashing booze all over his grease-stained jeans. He jammed his busted binoculars up to his face. A massive, sky-blotting sandstorm of white and yellow had just erupted on the horizon, mixing with the miles-long column of oily black smoke trailing from the mothership, blurring the midday sun into a dim red smear. The multi-thousand-ton alien ship was half buried in the alkaline sand, the massive trench it carved, still spitting crackling, molten metal slag. The residual heat from the hull was boiling the half-meter-thick salt crust around it, sending up massive clouds of white steam. The dozens of rednecks around him lost their minds. Guys were tossing wrenches into the air, blowing whistles sharp enough to cut glass. Charlie kicked away a bottomless fertilizer bag, his roar easily cutting through the lingering echoes of the blast. Ill be damned. 40th year on this earth, and that's the biggest damn drone I ever did see. He yanked open the door of the Ford F-150, not giving a damn as his bare back scraped against the rusty handle. He cranked the key, and the V8 engine roared to life, shaking the gravel right off the ground. He leaned out the window, throwing a hand sign to the boys tossing crowbars and bolt cutters into the truck bed, the veins popping on his forehead as he yelled, "Hurry it up! We get there late, and those other club bastards are gonna strip all the good copper wire. I guarantee you, the alternator on that thing can power 10 of our heavy thrust rockets for next year." The camp's massive speakers were brutally shoved into the back of a pickup, blasting heavily distorted country rock bass into the open air. Over a dozen pickups, spewing black diesel smoke, formed a crooked convoy and tore straight for the crash site. Tires crunched aggressively over the hard salt crust in a chorus of cracks and snaps. The wind whipped down Charlie's sweaty collar. The adrenaline totally drowned out the itchy, sandy blisters on his back. He mashed the pedal to the floor, the speedometer needle slamming into the red line. Even from 2 or 3 miles out, he could clearly see the pale blue smoke seeping from the cracks of that massive dark gray iron beast. With less than a mile to go, the bone-rattling roar of the truck engines and the heavy bass drums rode the wind, slamming into the ship's outer hull and vibrating the hairline fractures along its chassis to the beat. Torak lifted his head from the shattered remains of the command console, the blue blood running from the gash on his temple, blinding his neural optic interface. The bridge was thick with the choking pale blue smoke of vaporized coolant. Dead control panels spat out sporadic sparks. Every time the ship vibrated, the reinforced glass shards in his forearms dug a fraction of an inch deeper into his flesh. The alloy deck beneath him was throbbing with some chaotic, low-frequency resonance. The rhythm was raw and heavily distorted, nothing like the engine hum of any known interstellar vessel in the Galactic Empire. Torak turned his head and saw the frigate commander huddled by the radar station. The blue-purple blood from his broken knuckles had pooled in front of the dead screen. He was muttering endlessly to himself, repeating something about EMP, useless against fertilizer. Trajectory defies aerodynamic logic. The vibrations grew stronger. Through half a meter of hull armor, Torak could clearly hear the gritty, mocking laughter of humans and the brutally distorted drums of country rock. Propping himself up against the console, he forced himself halfway to his feet. Scanning the completely totaled system panels, his eyes finally locked onto the one thing still flashing a faint green light in the corner of the command deck, the emergency communication terminal. It was an encrypted channel wired directly to the Galactic Empire's supreme high command. With the ship downed and all other relays severed, this ancient relic, powered by a standalone isotope battery, was the only thing left alive. He dragged himself across the fractured metal deck, his knuckles scraping against the protruding rivets of the ruined panel. Ripping away a bent piece of metal plating, his blood-soaked palm smeared across the freezing alloy keys. He shoved a loose piece of comms debris to the floor and dropped to one knee amidst the glass shards and coolant. With a bloodied right hand, he slammed down heavily on the red emergency call button. A steady electrical hum bled from the speakers, followed instantly by the cold, emotionless standard greeting of the Galactic Empire High Command's comms outpost, cutting through the dead silence of the bridge. Torak practically pressed his face against the scorching speaker housing. His voice, torn apart from the screaming, rasped like grinding rusted metal. Retreat. Abort all operations in the Nevada theater immediately. The carbon-based life forms at these coordinates do not follow logical tech tree progression. They crippled our mothership with fertilizer and scrap iron. I repeat, do not engage rock-throwing lunatics with electronic anti-air systems. The hull vibrated violently in time with the rapidly approaching roar of pickup engines, and bridge bolts snapped off one by one. The comms signal crackled wildly with static from the heavy tremors. Before he could even hear High Command's response, a horrific, ear-piercing screech of metal being bent by brute force ripped through the air beside him. Charlie threw every ounce of his 190-pound frame onto the end of his rusty carbon steel crowbar. Wedged into the seam of the alloy hatch, it let out a teeth-grinding, screeching groan. Black ash fell from his scorched bangs as he strained. The coarse fabric of his overalls grated painfully against the sandy blisters on his back, but he didn't even blink. 3 redneck buddies beside him gripped their bolt cutters and hollered in unison. The final securing bolt on the hatch, already bent from the structural resonance, snapped with a loud crack, ricocheting off a guy's cowboy hat and showering sparks. The heavy alloy hatch slammed inward with a deafening clang. The heavy-duty flashlight in Charlie's other hand cut straight through the pale blue coolant smoke filling the bridge, the beam nailing Torak right in his blue-blooded gray face. Charlie's eyes lingered on the alien's non-human face for less than half a second before snapping instantly to the flawless, cold silver titanium control panel of the command console. He stepped inside, his boots crunching loudly over the shattered circuit boards. Heaving his crowbar, he slammed it down with a heavy clang, wedging up the corner of the console. His massive, grease-stained hands slapped the freezing metal twice. His booming voice drowned out the residual alarms inside the ship. "Boys, we hit the jackpot. There is enough sheet metal on this console alone to build us 10 Stage 1 rockets next year." The Rednecks, storming in behind him, went absolutely nuts. The clatter of wrenches and pliers echoed loudly. One guy crouched down to yank the communicator right out from Torak's fingers. Before the furious orders from the Galactic Empire High Command could even finish playing, the guy smashed the screen to pieces with a wrench. Another grabbed Torak by the shoulder armor of his combat suit, hauling him out of the command chair. Getting blue-purple starship blood all over his fingers, the guy brought his hand to his nose, took a sniff, and yelled back at Charlie, "Boss, this alien's got some serious bone density. If we strip his skeleton, it'd make a hell of a counterweight for our rockets." Torak slumped into the dirt. His only functioning optical interface was blinded by the sweeping flashlight beams. Coarse country rock drifted in through the open hatch, and the hum of pickup engines made his skull throb. A lifetime of interstellar conquest for the Galactic Empire. The inherent superiority of a higher civilization baked into his very DNA. All of it meant less than a piece of scrap metal for a rocket casing to these grease-stained rednecks. The final fragment of his interstellar campaign commemorative plaque slipped from his grasp with a soft clink, disappearing into a puddle of blue blood. Charlie stood on the pulverized remains of the high-precision fire control radar screen, hoisting his crowbar over his shoulder. He looked out the blown hatch at the dozen Ford F-150s pulling up, their headlights lighting up the shattered alien mothership like broad daylight. The wind howled through the breach, blowing the ammonium perchlorate powder from his bare back into the air. In the distance, the orange-red sunset of the Black Rock Desert stretched out endlessly. No one here gave a flying damn what kind of hysterical roars the Galactic Empire High Command was screaming into the broken comms unit. Because the casing materials for next year's amateur rocket launch competition, they had just secured them all for free.
Man, can we just appreciate the absolute disrespect here? A galactic warlord who conquered 17 planets gets completely folded by some dudes in a Ford F-150 armed with plumbing supplies and fertilizer. Hell yeah! My favorite part? Them looking at this terrifying alien admiral and just thinking, hey, his bones would make a great rocket counterweight. That is peak human badassery right there. So, let me ask y'all, if a hostile alien mothership crash landed in your backyard today, what piece of absolute junk from your garage are you using to take them out? Let me know in the comments. Drop a like, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Stay crazy.